Mahalo, Uncle Saul. All right, I'm just going to start off with an introduction prior to getting started. And again, we're excited for all of you folks to be here because it's definitely a crucial topic tonight on deep sea mining that alaka'i here in Hawaii definitely need to be aware of. And some of you folks might understand the basics of deep sea mining, and some of you might be completely unaware of what's been going on internationally. So we're excited to hear from Jeff and Uncle Saul this evening, which is going to bring in both the science and the cultural aspect and impacts of it. Just to introduce our speakers, we have Professor Jeff Drazen, who is a professor of the Oceanography department at UH Manoa. So he's going to be talking a lot on the environmental impact of deep sea mining. And then we have Uncle Sol Kaho'ohalahala, who is the po'o and the chair of Maui Nui Makai Network right now. And he is originally from Lāna'i, that has a lot of impact here in Hawaii around aloha aina and Mālama aina efforts, and someone who's definitely working internationally as a Hawaii representation on many aspects, but right now, especially around deep sea mining. So we're going to both be able to hear the science and the environmental impacts that this brings, along with the cultural impact that it brings, not only in Hawaii, but across the Pacific and Polynesia altogether. So without further ado, I'm gonna I'll have Jeff, I'll spotlight you, and you are good to go.
All right. Well, aloha, everyone. Tate, thank you very much for the introduction. And Uncle Saul, thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak to everybody here today. So what I'm going to do is talk to you about the environmental risks of deep sea mining. And I understand that a number of you do know something about this. So there's parts where I might go a little fast, but if anybody has a question and doesn't want to wait until the end, by all means, please speak up. I'm happy to take questions whenever. So deep sea mining focuses on three main types of mineral deposits. Hydrothermal vents are shown on the left, and those occur typically between 1,500 meters and 3,000 meters down. Seamounts, and the underwater mountains that they're looking at are typically at depths of 1,000 to 2,000 meters. And abyssal plains, and those are about 4,000 or 5,000 meters deep, and they're after nodules, these rock-like structures you can see here on the bottom right. And the metals that they're after are shown in white below the pictures. But what's really important is that the big interest in deep sea mining is for battery metals. What they're after are cobalt, copper, and nickel. You find those in these seamount crusts and in manganese nodules, and they want those for lithium-ion batteries for your Tesla or your cell phone. This is a mechanism to transition away from energy storage in fossil fuels. There are sources of these metals on land, but they are becoming much harder to access, or they have really challenging political issues around them. So companies are looking at the deep ocean to mine. Now, the scale of this potential mining is huge. This map shows in these little brown polygons here just some of the license areas in an area called the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. There are about 18 licenses shown in this map out of 30 that exist globally, and they cover about 1.5 million square kilometers. And for reference, all of these areas have been superimposed on a map of the continental United States, and you can see they span from California to Pennsylvania. So it's really quite massive. This figure shows that Hawaii is kind of has a front row seat to deep sea mining interests. It is in our regional neighborhood. This map shows the globe with colors representing the different types of mineral deposits. And it's actually a very optimistic map. There are many of these colored locations where the resource probably is not mineable. But there's two areas that are of huge interest that I want to point out. And here in yellow, the PCZ, or prime crust zone, is just to the west of Hawaii. This is where some of the world's oldest underwater mountains exist. And so they've had millions of years for these cobalt crusts to form on them. And so there's great mining interest in this region to the west of us for seamounts. To the south of us and to our west is what's called the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, shown in this map in blue. And this is an area that has really high densities of polymetallic nodules or manganese nodules on the seafloor, on the abyssal seafloor there. And they have very high metal content. And that's why so many of the licenses to explore deep sea mineral resources exist in this zone. So mining has yet to begin, but the equipment certainly exists. And we are in a phase of where companies are testing their equipment. On the top left, you'll see two large mining vehicles. And these little yellow things there, those are people with safety jackets on. So it gives you a sense of scale. These vehicles are just as big as mining vehicles would be on land-based operations. Down here on the bottom left is a Japanese vehicle that has been used to mine vent deposits and also seamounts in the West Pacific. And then I'm going to show you a quick video here. This is from the Metals Company, and they tested a vehicle in 2022, just last year. You can see the vehicle here with its little tank treads being lowered into the ocean from the ship. And this vehicle is connected to the ship and with a large pipe. People here operating the vehicle from a control room on the ship. Pipes right there, they're connecting sections of pipe.
Yeah, nodules.
So you can get an idea of what that mining might look like. This is a diagram that focuses on trying to understand where the potential risks to the environment would come from. We have our collector vehicle, as you just saw in the video, connected by a riser pipe to a surface ship where the ore will go to. And in this diagram, we're just looking at the abyssal seafloor. And the collectors themselves are quite large, and so they're going to remove these manganese nodules from the seafloor and also about the top 2 inches or so of the mud. And all of that will be shot up the pipe to the surface ship. So that is, of course, going to remove the nodules as habitat. And as I'm about to show you in a video, that habitat is important for a variety of organisms. And in the sediments underneath these nodules, that will also be shot to the surface, or it will be crushed underneath the vehicle, so it will kill most of the worms and other animals that living in the mud itself. So based on some economic models and statements from the companies themselves, it looks like they'll mine about 300 to 600 square kilometers of seafloor in a year. So over 15 years, which is half of a license that the International Seabed Authority will issue to a company, they'll mine about 10,000 square kilometers. So that's the size of the island of Hawaii. But there's also the effects of these big clouds of mud. The nodules on the abyssal plains lie on very, very fine mud. Think about what you would experience walking around perhaps in a lowie or in a slow spot in a stream. It squishes between your toes. That's the kind of mud that's on the abyssal plains, and these big tractors are going to kick a lot of it up into the water column, and it's going to take a long time to settle back down to the seafloor in the deep ocean where currents are very, very slow. And so those clouds of mud will disperse for tens of kilometers, and we're still trying to better understand just how far. But when it settles, it will bury animals. These deep sea habitats typically accumulate sediment on the seafloor at a rate of a couple of millimeters per 1,000 years. So a lot of this resuspended mud suddenly settling back down onto these organisms will bury them and have many negative effects. This could expand the area of effect to about 50,000 square kilometers of seafloor over 15 years of operation. and that's about 3 times the size of all the Hawaiian Islands put together. So now I want to show you a video, and there's an extended version of this video online. You can just type in NOAA Deep CCZ or Deep Seas, and you'll see it. But I'm just going to be quiet here and let you watch a couple minutes of some video from what these seafloor communities actually look like, and you can get an idea of the diversity and sort of amazing creatures that live on the abyssal plains. Can everybody hear the audio, by the way?
Yep, it's good.
Yeah.
Vast areas of the deep Pacific are targeted for seafloor mining. Yes, these are some of the most poorly explored habitats on the planet. The life of the abyssal seafloor, depths of 5,000 meters or about 3 miles, is weird and wonderful. They're animals with novel adaptations, sailing sea cucumbers, predaceous sponges. Yet most of these species have never been collected and are new to science. One of our main project goals is to explore the biodiversity of this region, to understand how they will be impacted by mining activities, and in particular to assess how areas set aside from mining, protected from mining, are adequate to preserve the biodiversity of this vast region. Why do people care about mining in the deep sea floor? Well, it's covered in some areas with black potato-sized structures that are full of valuable minerals, nickel, copper, cobalt, rare earth elements that we need to make cell phones. And the supplies of the minerals in these nodules are enormous, a world supply for many decades of many of these essential metals.
So often with natural resource management, we end up chasing our tail. The activity starts, and then we come up with a plan for how to manage it and how to conserve the resource. This has happened with fisheries, it's happened with mining on land, and it's very unusual here because these reserves have been set up before the deep sea mining has begun. So we hope through our research to evaluate whether these reserves are adequate preservation areas for the region.
Okay, so that gives you an idea of what some of those organisms look like, and it already gives you a hint at what I'll come back to at the end of the talk, and that is there are some no mining zones established now, so that's good news. Well, you've seen the diversity, so how resilient might these systems be to the impacts of mining? And here I'm showing you a picture of the abyssal seafloor. These dark spots on the right are nodules, and you can see where a scientific dredge was pulled across the seafloor, and you can kind of see the crumbled bits of mud off to the side here. And scientists did this as an experiment to see how the system would recover. So they came back 7 years after they made these dredge tracks. You're just looking at one of them here in an area that had a lot more dredging in it. And after 7 years, they looked at the organisms living in the mud in that track, and they found that they had only recovered to about 15% of pre-disturbance levels. So 7 years, and they still really haven't come back. Now, in this picture that I'm showing you, the test mining tracks look really fresh, right? You can see the little edges of the crumbles of the mud. And so I'm curious, how old do you folks think this track is when this picture was taken? You guys can just yell out a time frame. How long ago do you think this dredge was pulled across the seafloor? Any guesses?
10 years.
10 years, okay. Anybody else?
Someone said 15 years in the comments.
Okay, 15 years is getting closer. At the time that this picture was taken, this track is 26 years old. The deep sea is a very still place currents don't move fast, it's cold, animals don't grow and metabolize very rapidly. This is a system with a very slow pace of life. And so it's really important to realize that we've done a number of small-scale test mining experiments now, usually with just scientists dragging something across the seafloor, and in a few cases with miners actually employing vehicles. And we have found across all of these studies that most groups, whether they be microbes or worms or sea cucumbers, their density and diversity has not recovered after 26 years. A couple groups have, but most of them have not fully recovered. And 26 years is the number for the most detailed study that has been conducted for the longest period of time. If we extrapolate from this, we think that full recovery of these seafloor ecosystems may take 100 years, possibly more. And these nodules, they take millions of years to form. And many of the organisms, like the ones I showed you in the video, the sponges and the corals, they live directly on this habitat, and that won't come back over evolutionary timescales. So it's important to consider the impacts of mining. You can't just start in one quarter, mine an area, and then let it recover and then go mine another area. The areas that we first mine, for instance, in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, will likely not have recovered by the time most of the CCZ has been mined, say over 100 years or so. So we have to plan on whole system impacts. So just to summarize the risks to the seafloor communities, there'll be destruction of unique habitats, the nodules on which many organisms live. There will be species and biodiversity loss. Particularly the organisms that live directly on the nodules may not come back because their habitat cannot be recovered. And I didn't really talk about this, but we think there's going to be alteration of ecosystem functions, such as the storage of carbon in the seabed. So I do want to show another video. That's just the seafloor, but there may be impacts in the water column too. And these are a host of gelatinous animals that live in deep midwaters. This is krill, squids, fishes. This is the ecosystem between the surface and to within a few hundred meters of the seafloor itself. And it has a very different and unique biodiversity from what I showed you in the first video. And another important consideration with these water column ecosystems is that they're characterized, their food webs are characterized by connections vertically from shallow to deep. This diagram here shows phytoplankton on the left going through the different levels of the food web all the way up to the big things like this marlin that we like to eat. And the top is the surface ocean, and the bottom is the very deep ocean, say at 1,000 meters or 1,500 meters deep, which is still in the midwaters. Remember, in many of these places, it's down to 4,000 meters. But what's important is that many of the small fishes and squids and shrimps that live in these places, they live in the open ocean with no places to hide. So during the day, they dive deep and they hide in the dark. And they're hiding from all of these animals on the right-hand side. These are the ahi, the opa that are chasing them, trying to feed on them. During the evening, when it gets dark, these animals come back up to surface waters to feed on plankton, which is more available near the surface because sunlight has created primary production of the phytoplankton there. But it's interesting because, big eye tuna, ahi, they have adaptations and they regularly dive down to 600 meters chasing these prey. Swordfish will dive to 1,200 meters and sometimes a little bit more. So a number of these top predators here, the things we like to eat, are also diving. The point is that what happens down at depth may translate to shallower waters, even near the surface. And we need to be cognizant of the fact that these food webs, that the deep sea is not in isolation, that these food webs are linked surface to seafloor. We take a look at this map again, and this is the one I've shown you before, but this time I've added in seamounts on the right, and that mining would be much shallower. And mid-ocean ridges where you would have vent deposits and that kind of mining, and that's sort of an intermediate depth down here to the abyssal plains. And if you think about what might happen in the water column, well, transporting a whole lot of ore up a big metal pipe to a surface ship is going to be very noisy. And so that may affect marine mammals and other organisms. And when they bring the ore to the surface, on that ship, they'll have to separate out all the unwanted mud and seawater, and that's going to be pumped back in with the return pipe. Some companies are talking about bringing it back down to the seafloor, but some companies, the metals company is one, their plan right now is to discharge at 1,200 meters depth. Those sediment plumes, particularly for manganese nodule mining, will be quite large. We estimate about 50,000 cubic meters of muddy seawater a day. A 20-foot shipping container holds about 50 cubic meters. So this is about 1,000 20-foot shipping containers of muddy seawater a day being discharged into the water column. So we have the plumes, and then they are mining metals after all, and we don't know how much these might dissolve into seawater, but some of them will. Some metals will dissolve, particularly as the ore is broken into pieces. And so there will be a dissolved and chemical plume. And that is very poorly characterized right now. For the mud, we assume that these plumes will travel for tens of kilometers, and some experiments suggest 50 or 60 kilometers away from the point where they're releasing the mud. So what will that do? Well, that's going to have a host of negative consequences for the animals that live in this midwater habitat. It's going to clog their gills, reduce their feeding capability, smother some of them. It will reduce the ability for them to visually communicate. Lots of the animals at these depths of the ocean communicate by flashing lights to one another, but that light will not be able to be seen through the muddy seawater. So all of these individual effects will integrate into population level consequences. Changes in the abundance of whole groups of organisms, decreases in reproduction and reproductive capacity, etc. And those, if we sum all those up, may affect ecosystem services that we rely on. And I want to focus on fisheries because I think that's potentially quite an important ecosystem service that could be negatively impacted by deep sea mining. What are those potential effects? Well, many of the species we harvest may simply alter their migration routes or their distributions because they're going to avoid the noise and the disturbance of the mining activity. The discharge of muddy seawater into the water column may kill organisms in the midwater, or sometimes called mesopelagic realm. That's a portion of the midwater. And that could reduce the food supply for things like tuna and swordfish. And the other effect is that with the release of metals, and that is an unknown amount of metal at this point, but that could contaminate food supplies. And I want to show you a figure of demonstrating what I'm talking about. This figure has nothing to do with mining itself. This comes from a study of fishes around Hawaii, and we were looking at their mercury concentrations in their tissues. And mercury is on this vertical axis, and the depth that these animals frequently forage at is on the horizontal axis. So you can see deep divers like swordfish on the right-hand side of the figure, and very shallow species like mahi-mahi on the left-hand side of the figure. And what you'll see is that the shallow species have very low mercury levels, and the deep divers have very high mercury levels. The reason that this happens, and this is natural, is that the microbes that can take mercury and convert it into organic bioavailable forms prefer these deep water habitats. That is where they reside. Well, if this happens naturally, what will happen when we add metals to the water column environment? There is a very real possibility that those metals will enter these food webs and will get into our seafood supply. For nodule mining, that would be copper and cobalt that are toxic, and for mining of vents, that could include, in fact, more mercury. So that's something we need to consider. So to sum up, the potential risks to midwater or pelagic communities are reductions in populations of these organisms, changes in their distributions and migration routes. There is some risk of biodiversity loss, but I don't think it's anywhere near as big as the biodiversity loss on the seafloor, because we're not talking about removing a unique habitat, the nodule itself. Midwater risks also include altering the food supply or the provision to our seafood species, basically reductions in food to tuna and other animals, and contamination of our seafood supplies. So what do we do to protect ecosystems? Well, the International Seabed Authority is the agency set up by the United Nations that manages this on the high seas. And they mandate ecological study, basically what's called the generation of ecosystem baselines in all of these license areas. So this map here shows all these blue and kind of light brown boxes. Those will all require some level of study of the ecosystems on the seafloor before mining occurs. And then they're making rules right now for how, when mining occurs, how those ecosystems change, monitoring that, and then determining what happens. So if there are some really negative effects, does the mining stop? Or do they have to change locations? Or do they have to change their technology? All those rules are still being debated right now. But there is baseline study, and that's great. There are also no mining zones. All these green boxes were set up actually quite a few years ago now as no mining zones. And about 3 years ago, a number of us who study this region all got together in a big workshop, big international workshop. We shared our data. Most of our data comes from the eastern end near Central America, but we had also explored these green boxes, these no mining zones near Hawaii. And we tried to evaluate whether those no mining zones actually included the habitats and the organisms, you know, in a similar way to what was in the mining exploration zones. And the answer was no. Importantly, many of these boxes had been pushed out to the edge of this nodule zone, and some of them didn't include very many nodules. So fortunately, the International Seabed Authority listened, and they added these 4 red boxes. And in particular, this one my cursor is on right now, and this one over to the right, have lots of nodule habitat in them, which is really great. Oh, and just APEI stands for Areas of Particular Environmental Interest. That's what's on the map. It basically means a no mining zone. So what about midwater systems? That was the seafloor. Fortunately, a few years ago, the International Seabed Authority added a lot of requirement for companies to generate ecosystem baselines in the water column. And that was fantastic. And I'm leading an effort now with a bunch of scientists at UH, and we're creating the very first midwater ecosystem study in this region. It's in that red circle on the right-hand side of the map. And we're studying everything from microbes to fish, from the surface to the seafloor. And that's sponsored by the Metals Company. So that's great. We've been there twice, and it's the beginning of understanding what lives in the water column in this region. So I would argue also that we need to come up with some legislation on where miners can discharge all that unwanted muddy seawater. We've argued already that that should be quite deep, deeper than 2,000 meters, to get it out of these zones where our seafood species are foraging. And I would argue that in an ideal situation, that probably should be all the way back down to the seafloor. If they're making a mess down there on the seafloor, then why make a mess in another place far above the bottom? Just return all of the muddy seawater to the bottom. So what's happening right now? Well, the International Seabed Authority has 2 mandates: promote mining and ensure effective protection of the marine environment. So they're doing 2 things, and their goal right now is to approve the exploitation regulations at their meeting next month. So a lot is at stake here, because all of the countries that have signed on to this convention, which is most of the countries in the world, once these rules are ratified, there's a clause in there that says they have to ensure equal or better protection in their own territorial waters. So this is pretty big. Why is this happening next month? Well, there was a rush mandated by the island nation of Nauru, who has sponsored the Metals Company. there is a provision in the law that says that if a company wants to mine and is ready to mine, and the ISA has yet to approve exploitation regulations, they trigger what's called the 2-year rule. And it gives the ISA 2 years to finalize the exploitation regulations so that company can proceed under a regulatory framework. And Nauru and the Metals Company did that 2 years ago, July. So I think one of the issues is that a lot of perspectives are missing in the dialogue. That would include indigenous and cultural perspectives, which Uncle Sol is going to talk to us about next, which is great. And I would argue also the fisheries perspectives. Those voices have not been heard enough, at least not yet. So with that, I just want to say thank you to a whole host of colleagues. I shared some results that have been generated by many people, including other faculty, staff, students. I want to thank the captains and crew of all the ships we've gone out to these mining regions with, and also the Metals Company. They are the ones that are funding our midwater baseline. And thanks to all of you for your attention.
Thanks, Jeff, for sharing that. It's a lot of, you do really good at communicating this. So I'm going to go ahead and share a video that'll kind of introduce Uncle Sol and the indigenous impact of this. So here we go.
In our mind, there is no division of the seas. The animals of the sea don't see a boundary any more than we see a boundary. We have a great ocean of which we are related to and come from and care for, and that's our home. I challenge that perception that culture can only be by tangible artifacts. When we're traveling across the seas at great distances, we are intimate with knowing the currents. We know the waves and their movements, clouds and the weather. We know the resources that are in the deep seas. We have the culture of the people of the deep sea, and our culture is intangible. The ocean is everything to us. It's what we depend upon for our sustenance. Just to think that all of the different kinds of creation that is related to the deep sea will be disrupted, and then ultimately disrupt potentially the food chain of which now we have subsisted for millennia. In those conversations of mining, there's even no consideration that we come from this place. It's about minerals, it's about resources, it's about extraction, with no regard for culture. It's that bothers me about this process of deep sea mining. It's important for us to participate at these kinds of discussions. There is a culture of the deep seas. I want to be a voice of our ancestors. I want to be the one that says, we come from this place. This is our home, and you are now intruding upon it. And so that is an ultimate kind of destruction that should not occur.
Mahalo Tate for playing that little video. I think I wanted to have that precede my conversations because I would like to just bring it into perspective. So we have the Kumulipo, and in the Kumulipo, it says that Hanau Kumulipo ikapo he kane, Hanau Kumulipo ikapo, Hanau Kumulipo ikapo ele ika he wahine, Hanau ka uku ko'a ko'a, he ko'a ko'a puka. In the beginning lines of the genealogy, the Kumulipo, it tells us that we come from this place, the deep seas, and that the first creature to be formed from the vali, and the vali might be likened to the sludge that Jeff talked about at the deep seas, that matter in which all creatures are living in is synonymous to vali. This is the beginning of that genealogy of all creatures. And so from that vertical column of water from the deepest depths, all other creatures that come up that column into the nearshore waters, into the lands, into the hills and the mountains, and even taking flight into the sky are all part of our creation genealogy, the Kumulipo. And we as the people, we don't come into being until much, much later in the creation of this honua. But it is clear that when we are ushered into the honua, that we have an inheritance of caring for those elders that precede us. And therefore, our kuleana is to take care of our kupuna, and all the way to the eldest of our kupuna, which be the ukako'akoa, the coral polyp. So if we say then that this is our home, and this is our place, and this is our beginning, what is been made very clear to me as a participant in the intervention process at the ISA meetings or the International Seabed Authority meetings is that the body that's going to be making these rules and regulations for licensing and contracting for allowing deep sea mining, they have no provisions within their current rules that speak or even describe our relationship to the deep seas. In the rules, the current rules for the ISA, they have a section that's called Underwater Cultural Heritage. And by definition, what they mean by underwater cultural heritage is that if there's an artifact that's found in the deep sea that's made by humankind, it would be like ships or sunken ships or tools that are found. This could be considered underwater cultural heritage. Other than that, submerged areas of civilization that are now in the deep waters are also determined to be underwater cultural heritage. But when it comes to talking about our place of creation, there is no description. In fact, there is no understanding of that. And that's what I have been trying to impart in this body, is that you have left out an area that is important because it is our place of creation. And so they consider underwater cultural heritage as tangible things that you can touch, things that you can see that are made by humankind. But when you talk about the creation of a people and all creatures, which is not tangible, they have no understanding of what that is. So I have been trying to impart into this body that these need to be given consideration, because you are now talking about entering into the realm of our creation itself. And if you delve into this sacred place of creation, that disruption, as by science is saying, that disruption will be destroyed for unknown amounts of years in terms of recovery. And in fact, some of those species that have been created in that vali will never ever return once the mining process convenes. So I want to be able to speak to this at the international level to make sure that they have an opportunity to understand that we are part of this area of creation, and that what you are delving into is now taking away this system of balance that has been in place ever since mankind arrived in this place that we call Honua, island Earth. I have been very, very thankful that I've been given an opportunity to be able to intervene at the ISA meetings. And I'd like to intervene with a little preface by also talking about that we have a history in Hawaii that is unresolved. And that history has to do with the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom. And why that's relevant in my introductions at the international arena is that when Lili'u, our last reigning queen, was overthrown in Iolani Palace, one of the things that she chose to do was to translate the Kumulipo into into English, I'm sorry. And I cannot imagine that our queen, in the darkest hours of her life, had her nation and her kingdom had been taken from her, and she's imprisoned in her room, that she decides that she will spend a part of her time there translating the Kumulipo into English. And she says herself that translating the Kumulipo gave her some time because she had time to spend. She says that perhaps my friends will have something to reflect back on my time as the Kumulipo being translated. But she also said some very important things. She says that perhaps there will be a need for this in the future. And then she says, science might want to take, and genealogists might want to take a look at this. And so I like to think that what she's provided for us is a connection that helps us to understand where we come from. And with that, it's been now 130 years since the translation and the time she spent translating it. But that absence from the international arena also meant that Hawaii has never been seated at the table where these rules and regulations have been made by nation states. And therefore, I like to think that there is still a vacant seat at the table that belongs to Hawaii. And we need to be a voice to that vacant seat. And thanks to the vision of our queen that gives us an opportunity to still voice that. Until such time that our political history is resolved, it is clear that our resources and our place of creation is being challenged as we speak. So the other part of this is to imagine that these rules and regulations that have been made at the international level that created the law of the high seas, where nations decided that they could draw lines across the ocean and separate us all to authorities and boundaries. And it's clear to us as indigenous Hawaiians that there is no such line over the ocean that separates us. And so to look at the proximity of the Hawaiian Islands in relationship to the area that's being proposed for mining, the Clarion-Clipperton zone, to think that if we just are concerned with our subdivision or our boundary, and that everything on the other side of that boundary will have no impact onto us, is absolutely foolish. So, and then to look at the area, as Jeff has shown us, that it's an area that stretches from the south of Hawaii all the way across to Mexico. And that the plume that he talks about that is the result of the dredging is going to be suspended in the water column for unknown years. And then it will be much larger than the areas that they are mining. And that the recovery of this is going to be unknown. And some of them will never, ever recover. So for me, we sit in the midst of this kind of potential risk and destruction, and therefore we must have a voice in this process to be sure that this body cannot proceed without having knowledge of our cultural connection to the deep seas. And therefore, I've been participating at the ISA, and as we have heard, the meetings will continue in July, which is just a couple weeks from now, of where the decisions to allow this process to be licensed and permitted by the ISA. And we need to be there to voice our concerns for this process, and that there needs to be given consideration that we are the people whose country is the ocean. It is our home. It is our genealogy. It is where we are created from, and that these processes that they're about to be engaged and supported by the ISA will be destructive in every way to the place that we know as our home. So I thank you for this opportunity that we might be able to share this to as many people as possible. And I especially want to thank Jeff for bringing such detailed information about the process of deep sea mining to us. And I hope that this will help us to spread this concern and this word about the potential risks that Hawaii will be facing as a result of an international kind of process that delves into the place that is called the high seas, and that we need to be present and raise our voices as well. So I thank you for giving me this opportunity, and we'll leave it for any Q&A if we have time to do so. So with that, Tate, I'll hand it over to you.
Mahalo, Uncle Saul. That was really awesome. And I know we were firing up a lot of people in the comments as well. So yeah, like Uncle Saul said, we're going to open this portion up for a Q&A, maybe about 10 to 15 minutes. So if anyone wants to unmute or drop a question in the comments, come on camera, however. But is there anyone who would like to ask anything first? If not, actually, I had a question for Jeff and Uncle as well. But Jeff, for the question on the, what is it called? The APEI, that are where sections of not allowing seabed mining, how do they come to that decision of what section of the seabed that they don't want to be mined? And I know you were like, yeah, sometimes they moved it down, but yeah, how do those...
Scientists hadn't been to, it's such a huge area, most of it's never been visited. And I like to sort of describe the process as an informed one, but they know like, how productive is the ocean to the north? How does that change as you move towards the equator where it gets more productive? What's it like in the east versus the west? It's such a big area. There probably should be some protection on both ends, because it's unlikely the communities would be the same on both ends, right? You wouldn't expect the communities across North America to be the same, right? And it's an equally large area. So that, it was informed. They had maps from satellites, so they knew where a lot of the underwater mountains were. So they tried to pick places where there were some underwater mountains. But by and large, this is like trying to set up the national park system in the continental United States without ever having gone to North America.
Gotcha.
What are the chances we got it right? Well, scientists did our best, but did we get Yellowstone? Did we get Yosemite? Did we get Volcanoes National Park? I don't know.
Got it.
And then from a cultural perspective, Jeff, it is clear to us that all of these areas are places of creation. We know currently that in scientists now diving to the deepest depths have found that at least in our areas of ocean, that the deeper that they went, that the creatures that are there are endemic to that place. So we can clearly say that they are places of creation in itself. So the idea of the Kumulipo at work today is real, and that this entire area of the Clarion-Clipperton area are no different in its ability to be creative places than it is here in our own Hawaiian island. So I would venture and challenge to say that these areas are our areas of creation as well. But because we have made these determinations that these high seas belong to no one at an international level of discussion, that you can go there and it has no relevance to anyone, is in error. I would venture to think if Lili'u was not overthrown and she was seated at the table, that these concerns would have been raised at the onset of the discussions that created the law of the high seas, and therefore it would have been included. But our absence meant that our concerns have never, ever been given an opportunity for inclusion. So now that we're doing the destruction phase of potentially the areas of our home, it is important for us to make sure that we include this concern into the current discussions. And although we're not a voting member of that body because we don't occupy the seat, it doesn't prevent us from speaking. So this is what I think is important for us to do. Until we occupy the seat, we must challenge the decision-making of the bodies that have authority at this time. So.
Mahalo, Uncle Sol. Go ahead, Mike.
Aloha, Tate. Thank you, Dr. Drazen and Uncle Sol. My name is Mike Nakachi. I'm coming to you all from Mokuokeawe, from the Ahupua'a of Waikoloa. And, this has been something, and I appreciate you, Uncle Sol, being the ihe for many of us. And I just want you to know that you're not alone, Uncle Sol, and we all need to holomua and come together on something that is very critical. And it's more so a comment. And like Uncle Sol and many Kia'i Kanaloa, there's things where a lot of us have mo'okuauhau or are lineal descendants of and do have connectivity to many things within the ocean. And Jeff, not to pick on scientists, but you're connected already with, I believe, a form of trying to get that ike and that knowledge through a lot of these particular mining companies. But all of the people of Oceania will somehow be affected. And I think of our also ohana in Galapagos and Malpelo and Socorros and other places that would be affected. But what I'm getting at is, through the Kumulipo, as Uncle so eloquently put, there are forms of things where we know for a fact. I'll just give you an idea. Keopulupulu, which is a whale shark, which was revered by many Kanaka, visits Hawaii, and we know that they follow equatorial currents and probably go to the Galapagos, females that are hapai to then have babies, and that a lot of the kane are here, and also in the western part of the Pacific. So, there's so many things that I feel are not even included. We're talking about generational things that Uncle Sol is talking about, and this is very deep. Our connectivity to all of the different forms of Kanaloa had these pathways. They were their ways of navigation that would be affected by noise pollution, turbidity of water, compromising their well-being and their lifestyle. And like Uncle Sol, we have to be those kia'i to represent those that cannot speak. Even on the most minute level, we know that the largest vertical migration happens every night off of our shores. You've got them all, Dr. Drazen, all behind you, that that we know, according to how the phase of Mahina goes, billions, trillions of things work their way up to the surface that then provide for so many various ecosystems of different levels of the vast realm of Kanaloa and Moana Nui Akea. It floors me. Like Uncle Sol, I'm new to this discussion, but I appreciate it, Uncle Sol, and I'll just let you know my children will stand with you as well, who we all have this love of place, and this love of place allows us to navigate by Holo Moana on a daily basis from island to island. And we've had the privilege of going down to Palmyra and visiting things like Kingman Reef. And I just don't know how exploitation is what they call themselves has any word in the form of a cultural component, because it was not of our way. So that word is very aggressive and very demeaning to folks that are of aloha, that have the utmost for every well-being. And I just feel that I'm kind of on a Wala'au deep dive sesh right now. But what I'm getting at is that I don't believe that their environmental impact statements or anything have any type of cultural impact statements of any kind. And I believe that the law of the sea, and for us as navigators, I'm sure that, with all of the excitement with Moana Nui Akea's voyage and Uncle Nainoa and Uncle Bruce and the whole Polynesian Voyaging Society would probably also be very, their na'au would not be lined up, and they would probably not be in alignment with something similar that would affect this realm that they're going to navigate for the next 4 years and deal with this type of destruction of something that probably took, I'm on the island that's the youngest, 800,000 years old. But then again, we don't know. Jeff, you could probably help me on this. When you're off of Loihi and down in those depths, I assume that these seabeds, do you have any idea of how old they are? That's the big question that I would want to ask,
So are you thinking about like how old
yeah, like when you show the nodules in 5,000 meters, and you're talking about ancient things that we're playing with fire as humans just for this, right? Or for the electric car. I think there's times where we might have to pause or postpone or refrain, that we don't, we have a precautionary approach that is probably in the best interest of all people of Oceania, or people that have high connectivity to the realm of Kanaloa. So those are the kind of things that I think need to be discussed. Like Uncle Sol said, he needs to be at the table. We need more Kanaka representatives to support and be involved in this process. So I'm just grateful to be at this discussion, and I appreciate everything that Maui Nui Makai Network is doing. And thank you all very much for this time and space that we could share together. So thank you.
Mahalo. We have a hand raised here.
Hello. Yes, that's me. Hi, I'm Gabriela Ramirez. I'm a journalist based in Berlin, Germany. I'm not going to open my camera because it's 5 a.m. here. But thank you so much for your insights. And yeah, I had a question maybe for Jeff to start with. And I'm not sure if you could have insights on this, but so one of the main arguments from these companies that are pushing for deep sea mining is that deep sea mining could be less detrimental for the environment than inland mining, right? And I wonder if from the scientific perspective, this could be proved, like the environmental impact inland compared to the environmental impact of deep sea mining.
Yeah, that's a very hard comparison to make in a really rigorous sense. The different types of mining vary in their extents and in their intensities. And so I think at this point, a number of scientists have tried to make some of these comparisons, and they're very hard to make. No one's done one yet that I think is really very satisfying. Some of the mining companies, I think what they like to do is show pictures of, you know, beautiful parrots and monkeys and things and say, we can mine in Indonesia. And then they show pictures of worms and seafloors with apparently nothing in them and say, or we can destroy this deep sea environment. But that's not a comparison of impact. You need to look at how many species live in both of these places. What's the actual extent and the duration that those zones are going to be impacted? And that hasn't been done. I will say that the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, as an example, is one of the most diverse regions on our planet. There are as many species living there as in tropical forests or on coral reefs. It's an astonishing amount of diversity.
Thank you. And just another question, because I saw that you mentioned that the research you have working on right now is sponsored by the metals company. And yeah, I wonder about this conflict of interest, like the metals company paying for the research that's being done, and if there is a common or unison opinion from the scientific community on deep sea mining. Like, are all scientists against it? Are all scientists not against it, but more like being cautious about it? Or what is, I don't know, like, I wonder if how science can be questioned.
Well, okay, I guess I'll start with where I got where I am now. First of all, yes, I have a contract with the metals company. I co-own the data with them. All of the group on the team does, and we have complete freedom to publish. There's no sending papers to them for approval or anything like that. We will publish what we want to publish. So that is great. I wrote a paper back in 2020, which brought to light that the International Seabed Authority wasn't really considering the water column in any great sense. And that would include things like fisheries. And I suggested in this paper with my colleagues that we needed to team up with the mining companies who were working in these areas to start conducting midwater baselines. And the metals company looked at that, they listened, and they called for people to put their name in to do their midwater baseline. I just wrote the paper, so I figured I probably should put my name in. I mean, that's what I said needed to happen. So we did that. And we are conducting that first type of research in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, which is great. Are we for or against mining as a scientific body? Well, I can't speak for all scientists everywhere, but I can say that scientists try to be objective, and we feel often that our role is to learn as much as we can and share that information with folks like everybody here, with politicians, decision makers, with the International Seabed Authority. And I think that the decision on how and whether mining proceeds is a decision that society at large needs to make. All of us, not just scientists, but we're sort of fact finders.
Yeah, for sure. Yes, thank you so much. It's really insightful to know that some scientists more independent scientists are being part of this, because I was always afraid of how that works basically. I'm not sure if I have and could have another question, but Uncle Sal, I know you mentioned that you will be in Jamaica, and I think, as you mentioned before, it's so important that this community living in this Pacific countries are present there. And I just wonder, like, do you have any expectation, or what is your hope for this meeting happening in July?
Thank you for the question. I think it is clear that our perspective is not something that's commonly understood in the body, the ISA and the nation states that actually are going to be voting on allowing for this mining licensing and permitting. My hope is that we can bring to them in whatever manner, whether it's one-on-one, or if it's in an intervention on the floor, or if it's in a presentation or a side event, that we can bring information to this body, is something that is needed. And I would rather that we make our presence known, and we make our perspective known, so that in the end, should the ISA decide that they're going to move ahead with this process to allow, irregardless of our concerns, then at least we can say that we made every effort to impart and share our cultural concerns for deep sea mining. And if we don't, surely we will be told that we said nothing at all, So so we're in a difficult place right now, because we're not a voting member of this, and we are intervening as NGOs, as non-governmental organizations, but nonetheless, our voices need to be heard. And I will also call out to all those who have an opportunity to influence their own nation states who are members of this ISA to consider that this perspective is an important one, because we are now talking about perhaps the last straw in our destruction of our own planet Earth. And that should be something that we should all be concerned with. So.
Mahalo, Uncle Sal. That was really awesome. Before we close up, does anyone else have any questions or would like to say anything? Okay. All right, so we'll close up for this evening, but just want to say mahalo, Uncle Sal and Jeff, again, for bringing two perspectives to the floor. And I know we all need to get a little bit more involved in this, just like Mike was saying. So with the network, what we're going to be working on is just getting out more education and posting. And Uncle Sal, like he said, it's going to be at the ISA meeting in Jamaica come July, and we're hoping to have a little bit more representation of Hawaii there. So we're going to be able to post as much, but in the meantime, I think, getting more ike and more understanding and just getting a little bit more educated on this impact that's going to be hopefully not happening. That would, I think, be best. But any last words, Uncle Sal and Jeff?
Jeff, I'll give it to you first.
Oh, I guess I would just say, I hope that if this is new to you, or you're speaking with people, to share this information, because right now the fate of half the surface of the planet, the abyssal plains, in particular the deep sea, is being made by 30 people on the Legal and Technical Commission at the ISA. And I think these decisions need to be made by the people of Earth, and there needs to be more input into the process. So I really hope you can share and reach out to other people and inform the public.
And I just want to echo Jeff on that and say that, you know, our participation perhaps at the ISA can be one that will be supported by other entities. We're not standing alone, as he said, that there are many other indigenous organizations and people who are concerned with this deep sea mining, and building coalitions and support across the international community is something that we need to be a partner in. But we want to be sure that we lend our support, at least from what we understand is our relationship to the deep sea, and that the ocean is our country, it is our home, and it comes from our source, which is the Kumulipo. And with that, I hope that we can broaden our support here at home, and then just know that we are talking about Island Earth. We're talking about the Honua. We only have one place. And so it's not an exclusive Hawaii issue. It's an international issue. And that's where we must be to help support. So e kokua mai, we need help, you know, so.
Mahalo, and yes, we do. And so again, just a mahalo, and we will end tonight's talk. Again, this will be posted hopefully within the next week and to our social media platforms. So once it does get sent out, definitely send it out to your ohana and friends to get this message across. So ahui ho everyone, and he po malie.
Aloha.